Director, Rethinking Bretton Woods Project of the Center of Concern. So please, gentlemen, there is now somebody who is rethinking. You all from the World Bank and from the IMF, Mr. Cagliari is rethinking you. Thank you very much, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to spend my time actually developing what I would call the case for skepticism on institutional investment in infrastructure. And in some ways, this is going to be sort of a counterpoint to what Ms. Karp just said, and I think for the benefit of debate, it's good to have that. Now, I'm spending my time this way because there are many positive proposals that I have also developed actually in this same room and for more or less similar audiences, things that we need to do. And I'm a bit worried that the debate is being, a lot of the energy from the debate is actually being taken to discuss the possibilities of attracting investment from institutional investors for infrastructure needs, rather than focusing on these other things that I think we need. Professor Ocampo mentioned some of them. Of course, the focus on tax avoidance. There are these estimated amounts of $800 billion that developing countries lose in foregone tax revenue because of the lack of reforms on issues of tax avoidance. This is per year, by the way. The issues around sovereign debt restructuring, that we definitely need to have a very strong effort to reform what everybody now has already agreed is a failing system in terms of how to restructure sovereign debts in a timely way and avoid unnecessary costs. I would add to that financial regulation, the issues of financial reform, very important for development if we want a financial sector that is going to support the real economy rather than support the financial sector itself. And this is what we have seen in the lead up to 2008, financing being done for the sake of financing. And also the reform of the international monetary system. I think there are great opportunities lying there, especially the use of special drawing rights. This is a great tool and it's underused, but of course to being able to use it to its full potential, we really need a very important, a very deep reform of the international monetary system. These are the things that I think we need to be doing. Of course, yesterday we had also a very candid discussion with Mr. Tomasi from the OECD. He shared some of the shortcomings in the way ODA is counted. I think it's also, that's another important area because if we hear today that 6%, there's a 6% increase in ODA compared to last year, but then you read about the many things that go into ODA counting, then that may not be necessarily something to celebrate. So we have to also reform that aspect. But what is the problem with institutional investment in infrastructure? And there is here a very hopeful story that we hear about these 60 or 70 trillion dollars that are locked there by savers in pension funds, mutual funds, hedge funds, etc., and that we need to unlock that could go to fund long-term investment in infrastructure. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing against capitalism. I have nothing against private sector. In fact, I think the private sector brings to the table something that's very important, brings the risk-taking approach, the willingness to take risks for some ideas. It brings innovation, brings efficient ways of doing things, sometimes by using state-of-the-art practices on many aspects of development. So that's very important, but precisely because of that, I'm worried about the way the discussion goes, because when it comes to attracting institutional investment in infrastructure, you hear very often this, that the way to do that is to mitigate those risks. And how do you mitigate those risks is something that becomes central to the discussion. And actually that would be something that I fear could provide the basis for a lazy private sector, not the private sector you want, not one that will be innovating using best state-of-the-art practices. It will be a private sector that wants government handouts to do to follow its own profit maximizing agenda. I think the profit maximizing agenda is all good, but it should not be at the expense of government handouts. Now, the premise of this story is that infrastructure can offer the high returns that institutional investors are looking for. This premise is based on, there is mixed evidence on this premise, but it is based on two aspects. One, the ability of infrastructure assets on their own to generate these above average returns. The evidence actually for this is quite contested. Some people would say that the actual results generated by infrastructure assets that were far higher than average, especially in the lead up to the 2008 crisis, were a one-off event dependent on very contingent circumstances on the era of great moderation that they had to do also with more with the leverage that was into those deals than with the actual performance of the asset class as such. And in many cases, it has to do also, of course, you're talking about brownfield investment, which of course it will be easier to get returns from brownfield investments than greenfield investments, but greenfield investments are those, when we talk about developing countries needing infrastructure, what they need is greenfield investment, new investments, not the taken over of existing infrastructure. So there are, and in many cases you find that in the extractive sector, perhaps the returns were higher, but not in other aspects, in other areas of infrastructure. So there is also a whole discussion about whether infrastructure as such is a uniform asset class. Because there is a lot of diversity within what can be called infrastructure. You can go from energy to health to education to airports. There are many things but they all are infrastructure, and it's very difficult to assess it uniformly as an asset class. The other way in which infrastructure could enhance returns is because of its potential addition to diversification. So there is a low correlation at this moment between infrastructure assets and other assets. But let us remember that that was also the story behind the booming in commodity investments in the early 2000s. And pretty soon after you had a critical mass of investors rushing into the sector, now commodities is very correlated actually with the other asset classes. So there has been a change in that by the very fact of the asset class becoming a financialized one widely traded. So even the diversification effect, which may be out there now, we cannot guarantee that it will continue to be there. So if infrastructure cannot deliver the returns that institutional investors are looking for, how are investors going to go into the asset class? How are they going to be attracted into that asset class? My fear is that it will be done by shifting the risks of those deals onto taxpayers and onto consumers in the countries that host the infrastructure. Why do I think about this? Why them? Because they are the weakest link. If you remember, anybody who has also studied economics, this textbook case about trade, why is it easier to continue maintaining some subsidies for certain industrial sectors, whereas even though that makes the goods for everybody else more expensive, right? And it's because there is a very concentrated group of people who are pushing for that, but spreading the costs of more expensive goods onto the rest of the population is more difficult. So something similar happens here. You have a very concentrated group of investors that will be making those contracts, and you have the population at large who it will be very difficult for them to get organized and oppose tariff hikes, tax hikes. And why on something that presumably is about attracting financing, I'm talking about the cost to the public sector and the cost to taxpayers and to consumers? Well, there are many ways in which public-private partnerships actually end up costing money to the public sector. Of course, in many cases, the provision of fiscal incentives, direct incentives to ensure that the private sector will go to certain sectors. The foregone revenue, which is part of the contracts, the contract entails that the flows of revenue have to go into a special purpose vehicle to pay the private investor. This is very typical in a PPP. So that means the government stops perceiving that revenue. lack of investment, underinvestment, and the state ultimately cannot step back. There are sectors in which it can step back. It can say, okay, now I leave it to the private sector, and whoever doesn't have access, I don't care. Telecommunications may be one of those areas. There are other areas like health, education, where the state ultimately, if people don't have access, water, for example, the state will have to step back in some way or another, either retaking over the investment or the infrastructure built, or providing subsidies for people to have access where they were priced out by the market. So there are costs also of renegotiation of these deals. According to the International Monetary Fund, 55% of infrastructure of PPPs get renegotiated. And in most of those cases, the renegotiation ends up creating further new benefits for the private sector, not for the public sector. The renegotiation tends to go in one direction. In 67% of these cases, for example, it was about increasing the tariffs originally agreed. In 59% of cases, there was an automatic pass-through of new costs that the investor found after taking over the project to tariffs, so again, to users and consumers, or decreasing the fees that the private sector had agreed to pay to the public sector. So this is all documented, and it has to do with the cost of renegotiation. The OECD has a document, very recent, where they speak about their concern about some developed countries that didn't have good experiences with PPPs themselves, that the donor agencies in those countries are promoting PPPs in developing countries that would be arguably less prepared even to deal with those deals. And so I mentioned this to say that when I talk about the difficulties to negotiate good deals in some countries, I'm not talking about a low or even necessarily a least developed country. The countries that the OECD mentions here are countries like Spain or Portugal. So these are high economies, advanced economies that are suffering of some of these problems. So I think we may think that by attracting the private sector into some of these areas, we are addressing a governance problem. But I fear that, in fact, if what you have in the first place is weak governance and a weak institutional framework, the fact that the PPPs have this complex design that you can actually build these contingent liabilities, which are also, many of these liabilities are very hard to value. They don't even go into the budget. They will be exempt from public scrutiny, from parliamentary scrutiny. So according to the World Bank, PPPs may be pursued simply to postpone the budget impact of public investment and to move the associated debt of the government balance sheet in a way that doesn't take into account the longer-term implications for public finance. So when this is happening in the deals, it's very difficult to, if you don't have a very well-trained, not just capacity in the government, but also some centers of excellence in the population and an active public that is monitoring what's happening in those deals, the opportunities for corruption, I would say, are actually much bigger than the corruption that one may find in the public sector. And sometimes this is given as an argument why we need to have more PPPs because of the corruption in the public sector. I would argue that PPPs may actually make the problem worse because of the complexities that go in their design. So you may be undertaking obligations that will only kick in 20, 30 years down the road, but are going to be a significant constraint on fiscal space later, even if it looks like they are free in fiscal space today. So, Mr. President, I'm going to finish with this. I think it's very important to ensure that the benefits that we expect from PPP, from attracting investment from institutional investors, I think these outcomes that I have mentioned are not inevitable. We could still have some benefits, but for that we need strong capacities in the governments, and we need strong institutional frameworks, good governance, transparency, systems of checks and balances. And I would hope that in the post-2015 agenda, we would pay a lot more attention to how we build those capacities rather than to how much money we try to attract from the private sector just for the sake of attracting that money that may come with a price that we will realize too late has to be paid. Thank you very much.
Well,